Flashbulbs detonated as if justice were lightning, and Evan Cole felt the floor tilt beneath his shoes. A reporter barked, "Do you deny the post?" And microphones lunged like spears toward his throat. Evan said that headline isn't the truth, but the speakers spat the clip anyway. The crowd roared, and a screen looped his worst second, as if history had only one frame. Mara Quinn watched from the railing, eyes cool, phone lifted like a torch. Evan said, "Context matters," yet the word drowned under the chant, a rhythm sharpened by outrage. Jonah Reed pushed forward, saying, "Let him speak," while security closed ranks too late. Evan's name scrolled across feeds, fat and final, a verdict wrapped in font. He tasted copper and old coffee, and the fear that this room would become forever. Evan said, "I will answer," and the chant only grew cleaner, brighter, crueler. The cameras kept eating, and somewhere a door sighed shut behind him. Night pressed close to the apartment windows, and the city hummed like a judge who never slept. Evan set his phone face down, then flipped it again, as if truth might return with the screen. He said, "They didn't even hear me." And the ceiling replied with a radiator's thin hiss. A kettle clicked off, but he did not pour, afraid of steady hands that might betray panic. Photos on the shelf showed a life with edges, neat frames that no longer fit. Evan said, "I built all this for calm," and the siren outside laughed and kept going. The clip kept looping, the worst second hardened into a brand. He tried to rehearse the missing context, and found only breath. Evan said, "Tomorrow," I explain, and the word tomorrow felt like a locked door. He turned the phone over one more time, and let it buzz against his palm. Morning crawled in with the color of old paper, and voicemail bubbles stacked like debts. Evan said, "We can fix this," to an empty kitchen, then pressed play on the first goodbye. A sponsor spoke in measured syllables, and the word values arrived with a rubber stamp thud. Another voice apologized for pressure from above, and the call ended before breath. Evan said, "You knew me," and the kettle finally boiled as if cued for grief. He scribbled a timeline on a pad, arrows crossing like streets without signs. Somewhere beneath the noise, Jonah left a message that said, "Call me, I'm not leaving." Evan said, "One ally is enough," and underlined the day 3 times. The pad tore at the corner, and the paper curled like a burned wing. By noon, the apartment felt smaller, as if the walls had learned the headlines, and shrank in shame. Evan called his sister and let it ring until hope thinned to air. He said, "Lena, please," and the voicemail tone stood there like a guard. He typed a message, deleted it, then sent one with no perfect words. A photo on the shelf held their summer faces, sunshot and careless, a language loss. Evan said, "I don't need defense, just your voice," and the silence answered with impeccable logic. A news panel debated his name, each box framed in certainty and light. He muted them and listened to the apartment breathe. Evan said, "I can't blame you," and watched the typing bubble never appear. He stepped out because stale air had learned his doubts, and the street felt like a verdict delivered in sneakers. At the corner cafe, a barista paused, then resumed with careful cheer. Evan said, "Black, please," and the cup arrived with a napkin that read, "Take care." 2 students whispered, and a screen brightened with his frozen blink. He turned slightly, learning the geometry of smaller, the math of looking down. Evan said, "It will pass," to steam that climbed and vanished. A man at the door held it open longer than needed, charity dressed as manners. The espresso machine gasped like a witness deciding to speak. Evan said, "I'm still here," and the bell above the door chimed in a minor key. Morning light climbed the blinds like a careful apology, and Evan traced dust motes as if they were sentences he could finish. He opened the hall closet and found the old guitar case grinning with stickers from gentler tours. Evan said, "Before the rooms got louder, I heard myself, and the latch clicked like a metronome." A cracked pick waited under the strap, small as mercy. He tuned by habit and each string fought, then softened. Evan said, "Play the truth," and a melody limped into the kitchen. The answering machine blinked, a patient lighthouse that no ship obeyed. A headline glared from the counter, and he slid the newspaper beneath a placemat, like hiding a bruise. Evan said, I was careful for years, and the note he bent finally rang clean. The room listened better than the world, and for a moment he believed the world might learn. Jonah arrived with the knock of someone who has practiced not startling the wounded. He held coffee like a peace flag and scanned the room without comment. Evan said, You saw it all, and Jonah smiled, the kind you lend to dangerous bridges. He set the cups down and placed his palm on the old tour poster, as if to keep it from sliding off the wall. Jonah said, You are not the clip, and the words sat sturdy between them. The kettle hissed at a memory and found no one to burn. Evan said, They want a confession shaped like their echo, and his hands curled around cardboard warmth. Jonah pulled a chair close enough to be a shield, yet far enough to be permission. He said, We start by naming what is true, and opened his notebook. They replayed the night in slow slices, and Jonah drew a timeline that refused to lie. He marked the panel invite, the backstage corridor, the microphone swarm, and the misquote that bred like mold. Evan said, I paused because the man behind the camera fell and heard how small defense sounds. Jonah said, We need the witness who saw him stumble, and underlined the gap that swallowed him. A neighbor's radio leaked a ballad that used to be his encore closer. Evan said, I wrote that for people who stayed, and the wall listened kindly. The truth looked simple on paper and impossible on screens. Jonah said, We publish receipts and tapped the date that mattered. Evan said, They will call it spin. And Jonah answered, They can call it proof. Lena called at last, and the air brightened as if the apartment had windows it had hidden. Evan said, Thank you, before hello could break the spell. She breathed once, the sound of a door chained but open. Lena said, I needed quiet to sort the noise, and he nodded at the empty room. She asked for the version he would tell their mother, the one trimmed of excuses and sharpened to care. Evan said, I froze. Then I tried to clarify. Then they clipped the breath, and the truth found its shoes. Lena said, I believe you, but I am scared. And the word scared set down its bags. He promised to protect her name from the storm. Lena said, You can't, but you can be exact. And the call ended with a vow that felt like scaffolding. Clara requested a sit-down, promising fairness with a smile that never stole. Evan chose the back booth of a quiet diner where the ice rattled like small decisions. Clara said, You get full answers on record, and raised a recorder between the salt and the sugar. He watched the red light wait like a pupil. Evan said, No performance, just facts, and the waitress poured coffee that smelled like mornings with their father. Clara asked about motive, apology, and harm, the holy trinity of public penance. Evan said, I regret the harm of confusion, and I refuse the lie, and heard steel in his mouth. She held his gaze long enough to test a bridge. Clara said, We will publish what you give, and he nodded toward the truth they had drafted. The interview posted at dawn, and by noon the counter sang a number that felt like a verdict. Evan said, At least it is whole. And refreshed anyway, chasing proof that honesty could outrun heat. A new thread arrived with screenshots from years he barely remembered. Jonah said, We expect dredging, and drew a box around the most corrosive claim. An old collaborator hinted at patterns with a shrug that cost him nothing. Evan said, He toured because I vouched, and the coffee went cold between the syllables. Brands peeled off with statements soft as pillows and sharp as pins. Jonah said, We answer only what is true, and stacked receipts like sandbags. The clip returned wearing a new caption that bit deeper. Evan said, They prefer a mask to a face, and opened the folder no one wanted to read twice. Mara went live from a studio that glimmered like certainty, and the chat raced to keep up with her teeth. She said, We must demand accountability, and slid Evan's name into a slot built for fuel. The producer fed a graphic that framed his face with crimson borders. Evan said she was there when the cameraman fell, and felt the floor tilt again. Jonah said, We invite her to correct the record on air and drafted a message stripped of heat. Mara smiled for a sponsor mid-speech and pivoted back without losing breath. Evan said, "She knows the hinge," and watched comments bloom like poppies. A caller claimed a rumor that wore his jacket and his voice. Jonah said, "We logged the lie, then move," and pressed send. Victor surfaced with an email that purred, and the subject promised strategy with teeth. Victor said, "I can broker calm for a fee," and attached a deck polished to a mirror. He proposed a staged apology, flanked by influencers who sell redemption by the ounce. Evans said, "I won't buy my own spine," and Jonah's eyebrow climbed like a warning. Victor said, "Optics forgive what facts cannot," and leaned on metrics that loved noise. A retainer line glowed like a tripwire. Evans said, "We publish the timeline instead," and closed the window before the ink could dry. Victor replied with a smiley that felt like a blade. Jonah said, "Expect friendly sabotage," and archived the pitch. The article from Clara dropped with a spine, and each paragraph set a nail where rumor had smeared grease. Clara said, "This is the verified sequence, and let transcripts speak without varnish." The comment field tried to wrestle it back into a meme. Evan said, "Facts feel smaller than flames," and refreshed to watch them stand. Mara posted a thread questioning the outlet's motives, and harvested applause. Jonah said, "We pin Clara's piece and link the raw files," and the timeline breathed like a patient. A minor account uploaded backstage footage that showed a stumble in the shadows. Evans said, "There," and the word carried weight again. The clip gathered slow trust, while the louder storms kept shouting. Night brought the knock of cameras to the sidewalk, and the building learned to flinch. A neighbor filmed from a balcony, as if empathy needed proof. Evans said, "I will not run," and stepped into the hallway with a spine he had borrowed from Noon. A man shouted a question that was not a question. Jonah said, "We walk, we repeat the facts, we leave," and took the lead like a quiet lighthouse. The lobby smelled of lemon and nerves. Evans said, "I regret the harm of confusion, and I refuse the lie," and felt the sentence fit his teeth. Someone booed, someone listened, and the door let them out into honest weather. The email arrived at 2 a.m., subject line plain as a knock, and Clara woke with the feeling of a key in her palm. She opened the file, and the room cooled, as if the truth had lowered the thermostat. Clara said, "Who are you, Avery?" And the clip played a corridor no one had scrubbed. A voice off camera warned of a cable, then a thud, then a breath cut short by a shout. Evans said, "That's the fall," and his chest loosened where the rumor had nested. The second file carried a whisper of Mara, asking for a tighter angle. Jonah said, "Timecode first, chain next," and pulled a legal pad like a sword. Clara said, "We verify or we burn," and copied hashes with slow care. The city outside kept sleeping, but the story woke and turned its face. They met the sender in a parking deck that smelled like metal in storms, and the fluorescents hummed like nerves. Avery said, "I ran lights that night," and kept his hood up against ghosts and cameras. He showed raw footage where the cameraman missed his step, then tried to wave off blame. Jonah said, "You shot this on a work rig," and Avery nodded, eyes on the concrete. A second clip captured Mara saying, "Hold on his face while I frame the quote." Evans said she steered the cut, and the air thinned to wire. Avery said, "I kept quiet, because rent is a leash," and handed over a drive labeled like a confession. Clara promised protection measured in verification, not miracle. The deck swallowed their footsteps as they left. Back at the table, evidence arranged itself into a spine, and Jonah read each vertebra like scripture. He matched timecodes to stage logs, and the numbers lined up like obedient soldiers. Clara said, "Audio fingerprint confirms the room," and her cursor traced peaks that fit the night. Evan said, "If this stands, the hinge moves," and felt his voice land on something that didn't tilt. Jonah called a union rep to confirm camera assignments, and the roster named the fallen grip. Clara said, "We reach legal now," and exported a clean set with checksums stapled in metadata. Evan said, "No gloating, only fact," and the rule steadied his breath. The folder closed with the authority of a door that finally knew its lock. Mara found them before they could find her, gliding down a studio corridor where success polished every surface. Mara said, "You're chasing a narrative," and her smile perched like a hawk. Clara answered, "We're following tape," and held the drive as if it might sing. Evan said, "You knew the stumble mattered, and the ceiling lights flickered like a blush." Mara said, "I framed a truth the audience could hold," and the word framed clicked like a seat belt. Jonah said, "You cut out the breath," and her jaw ticked, a small metronome of pride. Silence gathered the shape of admission and wished to be words. Mara said, "If you publish, publish clean," and turned, leaving perfume and pressure behind. They recorded a statement that refused theater, and the room felt like court without a gallery. Evan said, "This is the verified sequence," and listed times, places, and the fall that changed a sentence. He thanked the crewman whose stumble became a cudgel, and named the edit that shaved context to bone. Clara said, "Files are archived in public," and posted the links with sober captions. Jonah said, "We will not argue in threads," and pinned the evidence where noise could not chew it. Evan said, "I regret the harm of confusion, and I refuse the lie," and the line fit again without splinters. Outside, sirens passed without stopping. Inside, the truth sat upright and waited to be read. The auditorium filled like a storm cellar, and the stage lights found a tremor they could not smooth. Evan said, "We do this in one breath," and felt his ribs argue with the idea. Jonah said, "Facts first, then you," and set the folder on the lectern like a compass. Clara checked the stream and nodded once, the way surgeons bless a cut. Evan said, "This is the sequence," and the room tightened, hungry for a different meal. He named the stumble, the edit, the thread that turned into a whip. A heckler laughed, and the laugh bounced, vain and loud. Evan said, "I regret the harm of confusion, and I refuse the lie," and the line locked into place. The crowd split into faces that wanted blood, and faces that wanted breath. Mara took the stage with applause that chose sides before hearing a word. Mara said, "Accountability asks for less poetry and more spine," and her gaze threaded the front row. Evan said, "Then hold the whole tape," and the screen behind them bloomed with the corridor and the fall. The room inhaled like one animal. Mara said, "A frame is not a lie," and the echo roded in the rafters. Evan said, "But omission is," and pointed as the timestamp kissed her prompt. Jonah said, "Chain of custody verified," and the slide lined up like truth on rails. Someone whispered apology without a name. Mara's jaw settled into a smile that didn't climb to her eyes. The Q&A opened like a trapdoor, and the first question wore a grin sharpened by followers. A man said, "Why should we trust you now?" and rattled a rumor that had learned to walk. Evan said, "Because trust is earned and measured," and listed the verifications without heat. A woman asked about harm, and silence stood to listen. Evan said, "I cannot unwind the panic, but I can stop feeding it," and the room shifted from hunt to hearing. Phones hovered like insects that wanted nectar. Jonah said, "Receipts are posted," and Clara pinned the links in the stream. Mara watched with an expression that read the tide and refused to drown. Evan said, "I will not chase your jeers," and the jeers lost a step. Victor appeared in the green room doorway like an answer with a price tag. Victor said, "The clip will never die, but I can lease you a future," and slid a new deck across the table. It glowed with influencers, sorrow packages, and a tour titled Contrition. Evan said, "I will not rehearse my heart," and pushed the folder back with 2 fingers. Victor said, "Then they will keep you as a meme," and smiled the way wolves do when maps run out. Jonah said, "We are done with theater," and opened the door to a hall that smelled like sweat and applause. Evan said, "I choose the slow road," and felt the choice hammer shut 100 easy exits. They returned to the stage for closing remarks, and the room felt less like a trial and more like weather changing. Clara said, The public record now includes the fall and the edits, and the statement clicked into the stream like a keystone. Evan said, "You can keep the headline, or you can keep the timeline," and his voice rang without tremor. Mara said, "I will issue a clarification," and the words wore dignity that looked expensive. A smatter of applause found courage and multiplied. Jonah said, "We are done for tonight," and the lights eased from verdict to ordinary. Evan said, "Thank you for staying," and in the hush that followed, he heard something turn, not loudly, but for good. Morning arrived without ceremony, and the city sounded like dishes being put away after a long party. Evan said, "Today is for ordinary work," and the word ordinary felt like oxygen. He opened the window and let street weather wash the room clean of last night's lights. Jonah said, "We keep posting the files on schedule and set reminders like guardrails." Clara drafted a follow-up note that thanked readers who bothered to read to the end. Evan said, "I will rehearse the set for that charity stream," and tuned the stubborn string. The note bent true, and he recognized the old patience wearing new shoes. Jonah said, "Small steps stand longer than grand gestures," and smiled without ceremony. Evan brewed coffee and did not scroll first, which felt like reclaiming a limb. He said, "I am not a headline," and the apartment agreed by staying quiet. Mara issued her clarification at noon, composed like a lawyer walking a narrow bridge over fire. Mara said, the segment omitted material context, and her voice held a careful, tempered weight. She cited the corridor footage and the fall, then stopped short of apology like a diver above cold water. Evan said, "I hear it," and refused to celebrate what should have been simple. Clara said, "We mirror the statement without gloating," and scheduled a plain link for the record. Jonah said, "This is not absolution, just alignment," and the phrase felt exactly right. Commenters tried to bait a victory lap, and the team stayed on the path they drew. Evan said, "I will keep repeating the same sentence until it is boring," and meant it. The afternoon moved forward like a patient train that finally knew its track. An email from the community center arrived with the tone of a neighbor knocking with soup. Director Alvarez wrote about a music night fundraiser that lost its headliner to fear. Evan said, "I can take the slot if the board is comfortable," and waited for the shoes of doubt to drop. The reply came fast, warm, and practical, asking only for a modest set and punctuality. Jonah said, "We disclose the context to them plainly and attach the timeline like a weather report." Clara said, "I will film and post the songs, stripped of angles, and packed the small rig." Evan said, "I want to play something quiet that does not argue," and pulled an old chorus from a drawer. The plan felt like a ladder built out of ordinary rungs. He wrote the set list in ink and did not shake. Lena called before dusk and asked for the time of the set, her voice steady as a bridge at last. Lena said, "I will be there if I can find the back row," and laughter softened what silence had hardened. Evan said, "Back row is yours," and traced the letters of her name on the margin of the list. He walked to the river and let the water hold the names of people he could not change. Jonah said, "Harm done is not erased by proof, only bounded," and the sentence folded like a map. Evan said, "I will carry it without using it as a shield," and the air felt honest. He rehearsed the chorus until it learned to stand without trembling. The phone stayed quiet in his pocket, and he allowed that mercy to be enough tonight. The community hall smelled like coffee and varnish, and chairs scraped the floor with forgiving honesty. Evan said, "Thank you for the chance to help," and the mic caught no tremor it could keep. He played the quiet chorus, and it lifted without needing to be loud. Lena said, "I'm here from the back," and the word "here" stitched a hole he stopped hiding. Clara filmed in a frame that refused drama and loved hands and strings and breath. Jonah said, "We post this exactly as it was," and checked levels that sat where truth belonged. Evan said, "I regret the harm of confusion, and I refuse the lie," and the line lived like a vow, not a brand. Applause rose, human-sized, and did not try to be a verdict. The night ended with cleanup, laughter, and the kind of quiet that keeps. The fundraiser video found small circles of light, and Evan learned to love rooms that did not roar. He said, "I am grateful for ordinary grace," and signed programs that smelled like ink and rain. Jonah said, "We built a record no storm can unwrite," and stacked fresh printouts in a calm pile. Clara cut a short film that let the music breathe without armor. Lena said, "You sound like yourself again," and the words nested where sleep lives. Sponsors still kept their distance, but the distance no longer dictated air. Evan said, "If the city needs a song, I will bring a song," and tuned to the soft pitch of now. The night loosened its jaw, and quiet carried them home. Months passed, and the city learned new scandals, the way seasons learn new leaves. Evan said, "I will teach on Thursdays," and a classroom of borrowed chairs agreed. Jonah said, "Consistency is the story now," and logged each small performance like a lighthouse tally. Clara pitched a longer piece about repair that did not preach. Lena said, "I can come to your class," and found a seat near a window that forgave. A local paper wrote a column that used the word context without flinching. Evan said, "Thank you for reading the long version," and the editor replied with a thumbs-up emoji that felt human. The air tasted of pencil shavings and second chances. The invitation arrived from a mid-size festival that prided itself on nuance, and the word nuance felt brave. Evan said, "A midday slot is perfect," and traced the schedule like a map without traps. Jonah said, "We accept with the materials attached," and sent the timeline like a passport. Clara arranged a panel titled after the pyre, which sounded like a road that knew where it ended. Lena said, "I will save the front row this time," and booked a train with a smile in the notes field. Evan said, "We go to play, not to argue," and the guitar agreed with a bright harmonic. The week breathed in, steady and clean. An hour before downbeat, a trending tag twisted awake and dragged yesterday into the present like a net. Evan said, "Someone cut the old clip again and watched the same second sharpen its teeth." Mara said, "I posted context months ago," and her reply threaded into the storm without theater. Jonah said, "We say the line once and walk," and pasted the archive as if planting a sign on a trail. Clara said, "We play the set as planned," and steadied the camera on its small legs. Lena squeezed his hand with a pressure that knew history and refused to bow. Evan said, "I regret the harm of confusion," and I refuse the lie, and closed the apps. The sky stayed blue, stubborn, and kind. He stepped to the mic, and the field quieted, as if wind obeyed a chord. Evan said, "This song is for anyone living past a headline," and the first verse opened like a door with hinges newly oiled. A chant from the far edge tried to gather itself, and failed. Jonah stood where he could be seen and not seen, a lighthouse in a jacket. Clara filmed the song, and the sky and the hands that kept time. Lena said, "Sing the bridge the way you wrote it," and he did with no armor and no bargain. The last note rang, and silence answered with something bigger than noise. Evan said, "I will be here tomorrow," and the sentence felt like the final blow that heals.